All right, good afternoon, everyone joining us today. Joining us from Malawi, Scotland, and different places. You're welcome to this webinar where we're looking at the Malawi at 60 governance series. Today, the webinar is focusing on the church and the state in Malawi since 1964 to 2024, and you are all welcome. You're free to introduce yourself online in the chat box so we know where you are coming from and who you are. I'm Nasim Vadalia from the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, and I am the Communications and Engagements Officer. Shortly, I will hand over to Stuart, who is the chair of the meeting. But before I do that, I just want to do a few housekeeping just to remind you of a few things. If you could just remain muted until you're asked to speak, that would be great. And when you're asked to speak, if you can unmute your mic and put on video as well so we can see you, it'll be nice to actually put a face on the voice that is speaking. This meeting is also being recorded and it will be shared online on our website and on our YouTube channel as a recording, just in case you want to watch it later or share it around. And also just to note that if you're remaining in this meeting and if you are sharing anything, you've given us consent to share it around as well. I will hand it over to Stuart. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nasim. Welcome everybody to this third in the series of these 6 governance webinars taking a Malawi-led, multifaceted look at governance over the past 60 years since Malawi gained independence. The Scotland-Malawi Partnership, or SMP, is an umbrella organisation which exists to support, connect and represent the many individuals and organisations in Scotland with two-way dignified people-to-people links with Malawi. We receive funding from, but are independent of the Scottish Government, and they do not fund any work that we do relating to governance. These online events proceed and are based on the forthcoming publication Malawi at 60, a political and economic analysis, which is edited by Gift Wasambo Kaira, Kenneth R. Ross, one of today's speakers, and Mzee Herman Yokanaya Mvula. We're grateful to Ken and his fellow editors, authors, and the publishers for sharing these insights pre-publication. As Nasim says, today's webinar is entitled Church and State in Malawi, 1964 to 2024. Reverend Professor Kenneth R. Ross will be very well known to many of you. He is Professor of Theology and Dean of Postgraduate Studies at Zomba Theological University, having earlier served as Professor of Theology at Chancellor College, University of Malawi, and as our chair at the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. His books on governance in Malawi include Democratization in Malawi, a Stocktaking, co-edited with King's Empiri, and Beyond Impunity, New Directions for Governance in Malawi, co-edited with Asayati Lorraine Chiweza and Wapu Lumuku O Mulwafu. Ken, we're very keen to hear from you. May I please pass over to you?
Thank you very much, Stuart. Are you getting me okay on your end?
Loud and clear, thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much for the welcome, and let me add my welcome, and especially those on the Scottish side, just to let you know we have a live audience here in Zomba, who are mainly faculty and students of Zomba Theological University. So it's a very, very exciting moment for me, because when I have the Scotland-Malawi Partnership intersecting with Zomba Theological University, it's two very big parts of my life that are coming together. And possibly even more extraordinary than that is I think it might be one of the days when it's hotter in Scotland than it is in Malawi. So make the most of that while it lasts, those who are on the Scottish side. And let me also take a moment to recognize the particular research effort of which today's presentation is a small part. It's an effort to take account of Malawi's first 60 years as an independent nation. We have currently an editorial team that is working hard to complete and publish a book that assembles a range of perspectives. But while we're working on that, we're really delighted that some of the main ideas of the book can be aired in this webinar series. So big thanks to everyone who has made it possible. But let me not lose time before coming to the topic for today. Nowadays, the church is such an obvious feature on the Malawi landscape that it becomes difficult to remember that at independence, there was some question about what place the church would have in the life of the newly born nation. Christianity seemed to be much identified with the colonial order that was now coming to an end. The initiative lay with the nationalist movement that was coming to power. And occasionally on the campaign trail, Kamuzu Banda would suggest that he could get on fine without Christianity if the churches did not fall in line with his project. So it looked a bit uncertain exactly what lay ahead for the churches, particularly in their relation to the state. Today's paper is an attempt to trace what transpired across the 60 years, which I've divided into 4 periods: the one-party era from 1964 to 1992, the political transition from 1992 to 1994, the early democratic period from 1994 to 2004, and the later democratic period from 2004 to 2024. So it's a simple layout. We're just going to take a look at each of these 4 periods in turn. So first of all, the one-party era, 64 to 92. When Malawi gained her independence in 1964, relations between the churches and the newly established state were somewhat equivocal. On the one hand, the Congress movement that led the struggle for independence was largely the product of Christian missions, particularly the Scottish Presbyterian missions of Livingstonia and Blantyre. The vast majority of Malawians, including most church members, had been actively supportive of the drive for independence. Notably, guided by the leaders of Blantyre and Livingstonia synods, the Church of Scotland declared in 1959 that the time has come for a daring and creative transfer of power to the African people, a significant case of Malawi's relationship with Scotland proving to be decisive in the political sphere. So there was considerable alignment between the witness of the churches and the political direction of the soon-to-be independent state. On the other hand, there were also tensions between them. Even among the Presbyterians, the more militant wing of the Congress movement clashed with church leaders who were pro-independence, but also conscious of their pastoral responsibility to hold the whole community together across different shades of political opinion. Stephen Kauta Msisya, the moderator of the Synod of Livingstonia, found himself being subjected to threats and abuse from militant Congress activists in the north. Things took an even more sinister turn when the CCAP minister at Dedza, the Reverend Alexander Kuchona Mbewe, was brutally murdered in December 1964, apparently at the behest of the MCP leadership. Kuchona was a supporter of the MCP, but he was outspoken in his criticism of the totalitarian direction that he believed it was taking. The other large-scale nationwide church in Malawi, the Catholic Church, had also experienced the intolerant side of the incoming MCP regime. Late in 1960, some independence activists who'd become disillusioned with the Congress because of its authoritarian tendencies formed the Christian Democratic Party, led by John Chester Katsonga. The MCP reacted furiously with heavy criticism of the Catholic Church. The situation turned ugly on 5 December 1960, when Katsonga's house was burnt to the ground. Though there was some rapprochement between the MCP leadership and the Catholic hierarchy, the MCP remained implacably opposed to the formation of opposition political parties. This was grimly signaled in Limbe on Christmas Eve 1963 by the murder of Gilbert Ponde Ponde, a practicing Catholic, an indefatigable champion of political pluralism. Kanyama Chiume later confirmed that the murder had been instigated by the MCP leadership. It became clear that MCP rule would leave little, if any, space for anything other than unquestioning loyalty. The stormy experiences of the early 1960s left the Catholic Church cautious in the post-independence situation about any actions that might provoke a confrontation with the state. The Anglican Church, too, was circumspect about political exposure, particularly since the main leader of the opposition to Banda after the cabinet crisis, Henry Masauko Chipembere, was an Anglican. The church close to the government, and I quote, "Because of this assimilation and alignment with the MCP, the church gradually lost its ability to admonish or speak pastorally to the government." At the same time, most of the rebel ministers who broke with Banda at the cabinet crisis were prominent members of the CCAP. So there was a question over its loyalty. The smaller churches could not afford to allow for any questions over their loyalty either. The result was that almost all the churches ended up taking great care to avoid any action that might provoke a reaction from the state. Meanwhile, a consistent part of the rhetoric of the regime was that the government allowed freedom of worship. To some extent, this was true. Churches were free to meet for worship and follow their own traditions without interference from the government. Yet, there was a tacit understanding of quid pro quo, that in return for this freedom, the churches would demonstrate unquestioning loyalty to the ruling regime. Laudatory and sycophantic prayers for the long life of the president became the order of the day at church services. Sermons were expected to avoid politically sensitive issues. Most of the time, they did. Nevertheless, in a society where almost all associational life was under the control of the ruling party, church life supplied an alternative space, and one that always carried the potential to become subversive. As most churches came to terms with this uneasy accommodation with a totalitarian state, one religious group declined to do so. The Jehovah's Witnesses were peaceful, law-abiding citizens, but their beliefs prevented them from doing military service or taking any part in politics. This meant that they refused to buy the party card, that for the MCP was the indispensable badge of loyalty. The wrath of the party machine was turned upon them, and they suffered humiliation, loss of property, beating, imprisonment, and even death. The fact that they were being persecuted for their religious beliefs was a troubling matter for church leaders, but they were never able to take any effective action to resist it. It was also something of a lightning rod issue. The state was demonstrating what it could do to any religious community that did not comply with its requirements. If you're there, Chad, I think we just need the slides to catch up a little bit. If you get to lightning rod, you'll be with us. Another flashpoint was theological education, of which the one-party regime was instinctively suspicious. Twice, the CCAP Theological College, from which I am speaking today, was abruptly closed by the government when incidents occurred that suggested it was fostering a critical approach in relation to political matters. By and large, however, the churches, like the rest of the society, were silent. There were, however, exceptional church leaders who put themselves at risk by speaking truth to power. For example, Blantyre Synod General Secretary Jonathan Sangaya, in his one-on-one confrontations with Kamuzu Banda behind closed doors. His successor, Saindi Chipangwi, with his provocative sermons on national occasions. And Koma Synod moderator Josephat Mwali's steadfast refusal to participate in MCP events. Anglican priest Jack Biggers standing up for the Jehovah's Witnesses. Catholic priest Patrick O'Malley in his solidarity with detainees. The costly witness of such leaders helped people to keep faith with the churches amidst a bleak and frightening political landscape. Also significant was the fact that the life of the church allowed citizens to access a frame of reference outside the all-pervasive propaganda of the ruling regime. Though much remained implicit, church members could draw their own conclusions when they detected a contrast between the content of their faith and the political reality prevailing in Malawi. So let me come to our second main division, the transition to democracy, 1992 to 94. What had largely remained implicit became explicit in a dramatic way when the Roman Catholic bishops published their pastoral letter, Living Our Faith, on the 8th of March, 1992. If there had been doubts about whether or not the church could exercise significant political influence in independent Malawi, these were comprehensively dispelled in a single day. In fact, the publication of the pastoral letter became a defining event. While the process of political change that it ignited took 2 years to mature, it was already apparent in March 1992 that Malawi could never be the same again. The bishops offered such a compelling indictment of the shortcomings of the one-party regime that its credibility was beyond recovery. The government itself was quick to identify the threat to its authority. An emergency meeting of the ruling Malawi Congress Party banned the letter and even threatened the lives of the bishops. The letter exploded the myth that all Malawians were prospering under the beneficent reign of life President Kamuzu Banda and called out the repression that had been a hallmark of the one-party system. Once this was published, it quickly created a social consensus that there was need for Malawi to build a new political system. The extraordinary power of the letter can be explained to quite some extent simply by the fact that it stated what everyone knew but had not been able to say. The letter can be seen as a crystallizing and catalyzing a movement for change that was already in formation. Nevertheless, it's not clear who else would have broken the spell of the one-party regime had the church not done so. Who else at that time could have written, published, and disseminated a comprehensive critique of the prevailing political system? The Catholic Church had the independent leadership, the institutional strength, the printing press, and the parish network that meant it was uniquely well placed to present such a daring challenge to the all-powerful ruling regime. Moreover, the other churches were also sufficiently independent of the government that they could rally behind the Catholic bishops. The Presbyterian synods of Blantyre and Livingstonia were instrumental in creating the broad-based Public Affairs Committee, PAC, which included not only most of the churches, but also, importantly, the Muslim Association, the Malawi Law Society, and the associated chambers of commerce and industry. This one-party organization was recognized in national political life, and PAC became the engine of political reform in the crucial 1992 to 93 period. Assessing the African
We seem to have lost Ken's audio for now. I'm just checking that it's not just me at my end at Scotland, which is entirely possible, but
yes. No, it happens with some regularity. He's back.
Great stuff.
But we can't hear you right now, Ken.
Hello?
Now we can. Now we can.
Good. Okay. No, thanks a lot. Sorry, slight interruption there. I think we just had a network blip here in Zomba. Just coming to the end of reflecting on the dramatic events of 1992 to 94, The veteran historian Terence Ranger, surveying the African scene at the time, observed that political institutions have lost all credibility, but ecclesiastical institutions have been gaining it. Malawi was a case in point. The political elite had lost touch with the people at the grassroots, while it was the churches that had become deeply grounded in local communities. At a time when society was dominated by the all-pervasive propaganda of the Banda regime, church life provided a space where different values could be cultivated, different perspectives could be offered, from which a different vision of the future could emerge, and which, in due course, provided the platform from which a movement for political change could be launched. Excuse me. So, third section is on the early democratic period, the 10 years from 1994 to 2004. The central role of the churches as midwives of the transition from one-party dictatorship to multi-party democracy meant that there were high expectations as to the role they would play in the democratic era. Even President Bakili Muluzi asked the churches to correct the government should it ever stray from the path. It looked like the churches had come in from the cold and were now expected to play a critical prophetic role in Malawi's public life. At the same time, to some extent, there was a replay of the early 1960s situation when the churches had been closely allied with a political movement that was fighting for justice. Then it was difficult to achieve critical distance when the protesting political movement became the government in power. Now again, there was a similar dynamic, as those who had been together in the heat of resistance to the one-party dictatorship now had to find their distinct roles in church and state. The lines were blurred when church leaders became government ministers or accepted diplomatic postings. State patronage could silence voices with the potential to be critical. At the same time, a new generation of church leaders emerged who had learned from the silence and complicity that marked the church's role during the one-party era. Anglican Bishop James Tenga Tenga made it clear that, I quote, "We will support the government when it does good, but we will not hold our peace when it goes wrong. We will not sit quietly when injustice and the gravy train gets the better of our politicians, whatever their political shade or position." As the Muluzi administration established itself, the operation of the gravy train was increasingly evident, as was people's disillusionment with the democracy in which they had invested so much hope. Among others, church leaders sensed that the government was serving the interests of a small elite at the expense of the majority. But much of this was a matter of shades of grey, lacking a very clear black and white issue on which the church could take a decisive stand. This changed in the early 2000s, when it became apparent that the incumbent UDF government was maneuvering to change the constitution to remove the two-term limit on presidential terms, so as to allow the possibility that Muluzi could stand for a third term. The CCAP General Synod issued a comprehensive analysis of the social political issues in Malawi, which expressed concern that the democratization movement was losing its way, and in particular, that the proposed constitutional change would be a great setback. The extent to which this statement struck a raw nerve with the government is revealed by the fact that within a week, it had published an 18-page rejoinder. When the open term bill finally came to Parliament, it fell just 3 votes short of the 2/3 majority required to change the constitution. Many commentators judged that the influence of the churches had been decisive. Meeting the crisis provoked by the third term issue enabled the churches to clarify their role in Malawi's democratic era. They emerged as champions of the constitution in a context where the government was recurrently tempted to tamper with the constitution for short-term political advantage. In doing so, the churches made it clear that they were independent of the power of the state and could take a critical stance towards it when required, neither intimidated by the threat of violence nor succumbing to state patronage. They thus gained popular confidence as guardians of Malawi's hard-won democracy when it was under threat from self-serving politicians. And now our final period, the later democratic period of 2004 to 24. Now, if the early 2000s represented a moment of clarity and unity for the churches in their relations to the state, it was a short-lived experience. The subsequent years have seen the churches struggling with an environment in which it's often been difficult for them to play a convincing role. Instead of the sharply defined issue presented by the constitutional crisis, the defining political reality of the first decades of the 21st century has been all-pervasive corruption. There was no shortage of church statements on the evil of corruption, but they tended to simply echo what everyone else was saying, rather than bringing anything distinctive to public life. It also appeared that, like everyone else, the churches struggled to find leverage to bring about any meaningful change. Part of the reason why the churches were struggling to engage convincingly with the state during an era defined by corruption is that there's a question as to how far they themselves were tarred with the same brush. As Augustine Musopoli pointed out, most of the corruption is done by people who sit in the pews every Sunday. Moreover, not only individual Christians, but the churches as institutions were sucked into the politics of patrimonialism and clientage. Often, the operation of the churches mirrored that of the state, rather than promoting a contrast to it. This difficulty is compounded by an entanglement of political life and church life. Malawian politics during the democratic era has been largely a contest between regional power blocks. Most of the churches are also organized regionally, so there are many possibilities for alliances and mutual support between regionally based political parties and regionally organized churches. The CCAP is particularly vulnerable in this regard, as its 3 synods largely coincide with the 3 political divisions of the country. When a synod implicitly or explicitly identified itself with a particular political party in a patrimonialist context, it was generally assumed that it was being rewarded for doing so. Bluntly, it had been bought and no longer had an independent voice with which to address national affairs. Another significant trend in Malawi's church life during this period has been described as Pentecostalization. This is significant for church-state relations, since Pentecostals tend to be found on the conservative side in the global culture wars that have loomed large in the early 21st century. High on their agenda have been moral issues such as abortion or sexual identity, while concerns for economic justice or democratic constitutionalism, which had been prominent in church-state engagement in Malawi in the 1990s, are not mentioned so much. This has opened the way to new alliances of political leaders and church leaders that are defined by commitment to conservative social ethics, with less concern for economic and environmental justice or democratic values. 21st century trends have brought about an enmeshment of prosperity gospel Christianity with patrimonialist politics, of ethnically based parties with regionally organized churches, and of conservative social ethics with elite consolidation of power. These tendencies have limited the capacity of the churches to offer the needed prophetic critique to the state. At times, some have been only too happy to become court chaplains. Nevertheless, notwithstanding compromises and mistakes, the churches have continued to enjoy popular confidence, and church statements on national affairs carry weight, especially during tense or troubled times, not least in the run-up to elections. The Malawi public puts a premium on the voice of the church. So let me come to the conclusion, just to give a summary of what I've been presenting. During Malawi's 60 years as an independent nation, church-state relations have come through distinct phases. The one-party period, 1964 to 92, was largely marked by silence and complicity on the part of the church, though there remained a small element of critical distance that proved to be significant for the future. The period of transition to democracy, 92 to 94, was perhaps the church's finest hour, when it was not clear how Malawi could emerge from the dictatorship that needed to be replaced. The churches turned out to be the midwives who enabled the birth of a democratic dispensation. This created a burden of expectation as Malawi navigated its early years as a democracy from 1994 to 2004. To some extent, the churches were wrong-footed by the extent to which undemocratic currents resurfaced in the new era. But they found their moral compass in time to successfully resist Bakile Muluzi's third-term bid. The more recent years of the later democratic era, from 2004 to 24, have been marked by an entanglement of church and state that has often made it difficult for the church to offer a distinctive witness. Nevertheless, particularly at moments of national crisis, the prophetic voice of the church has sounded forth in convincing ways. An element of continuity through these successive phases is that Malawians have had confidence in their churches and expected them to step in correctively whenever the state was letting them down. Although the churches have at times been compromised by state patronage and debilitated by their own internal politics, still they retained a stature that made them significant players at all levels of Malawi society. If there was some question in 1964 about whether or not the churches would play a significant role in public life, 60 years later, there can be no doubt. Even the state itself has relied to quite some extent on the affirmation, critique, and renewal that it has received from the churches. Thank you very much to everyone, both the live audience here in Zomba and those joining online.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ken. That's fascinating. I was going to suggest that since there was a live audience, it would be appropriate for a round of applause, but there was no need for the invitation. It was spontaneous. And I'm sure that your words will have generated a great deal of questions and comment. But we're going to turn first to Professor Scott Spurlock, who is Professor of Scottish and Early Modern Christianities at the University of Glasgow, with a particular focus on Scottish and Irish religious cultures. He's an elected member of the Church History Society of Southern Africa. Scott, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Scotland-Malawi Partnership for the opportunity to participate today. It is always a pleasure to engage with the work of Professor Ross, who throughout the rest of what I'm going to say, I'm just going to call Ken, as I'm sure he would prefer from all those who know him. His writing is always clear, probing, very learned, and balanced in its analysis, and that has certainly rung true today in what he's given to us. I just want to begin by making two apologies. The first is I apologize if I overlap with some of what he said. I prepared some comments in advance, and there may be a bit of overlap. And secondly, I hope you'll just let me give it a little bit of context in relation to myself and Malawi. And for those of you who attended the book launch for the 100 years of the CTAP, this will be a bit of a repetition, but it's probably useful. So I became exposed to and interested in Malawi as I began postgraduate studies at New College, Edinburgh. On day one, I met Dr. Jack Thompson. By day two, I met a new lifelong friend in Isabel Reed, who is a fellow student and who I'm sure everyone here is familiar with through her very significant contribution to this community. And I also grew to know quite well Andrew Ross, who had supervised my own undergraduate teacher, but we were also members of the same church in Morningside. And who could not develop a deep and meaningful interest in Malawi when one comes into the orbit of these three dynamos? When Andrew died, he left an unfinished manuscript that would become Colonialism to the Cabinet Crisis, which was published in 2009. And at his death, Joyce asked Jack Thompson to finish that book. And Joyce also asked me to be Jack's gopher. So I became quite intimately acquainted with the work and the scholarship and chasing down some missing sources. So that's a bit about my connection and interest in Malawi. It is important to remember that Ken's contribution that he's set out today is part of a wider study marking the 60th anniversary of Malawi as a state, and in particular, a critical reflection on politics and governance, with a particular focus, even more so, on the relationship of the churches in that process. And I might also make a quick sidebar interjection here that Ken and I had some discussions about marking a shared anniversary of 60 years of the nation of Malawi and 25 years since Scotland had its parliament established. But it failed on two fronts. One, I don't have the energy or the productivity to keep up with Ken. That's the first flaw. And secondly, the politics of Scotland and its own parliament and its own reigning political party made it not the best time for probing analysis into how the parliament has functioned. Other people were responsible for doing that in the intervening period of time. So just thinking a bit about Ken's contribution in this chapter, as he has said, he sets out 4 very clear epochs in the history of Malawi and the engagement of the churches. The one-party era from 1964 to 92. Initially, churches in the new Malawi Congress Party had close ties, particularly with the Presbyterian Church, the CCAP. However, tensions quickly emerged as the MCP became increasingly authoritarian under President Hastings Kamuzu Banda, and its repression of political dissidents and the Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. The second period, focusing on the transition to democracy, 1992 to 94. Ken calls this the finest hour of Malawi's churches, particularly the Catholic bishops and their pastoral letter, Living Our Faith in 1992, which echoed the previous letter that they had produced in 1961. But this 1992 letter from the bishops provided a devastating critique of the one-party system, exposing poverty, repression, and a lack of political participation. The letter also catalyzed the democratization movement and led to the formation of the Public Affairs Committee, which represented a number of faith groups and churches, and has had a lasting impact on the political landscape of Malawi. The third epoch, the early democratic period, where churches initially struggled to define their role in the new democracy, with some leaders accepting government positions. However, churches found their voices when President Maluzi attempted to change the constitution to bring back a kind of political reign that was probably too close to recent memory. And then, of course, the later democratic period from 2004 to 2024, this era has been characterized by significant government corruption. For example, as Ken notes in his own chapter, that within the first 10 years of this political dispensation, it's estimated 35% of government funds had been appropriated in for non-governmental purposes, and also increasingly complex church-state relations. Churches have struggled to address the endemic corruption effectively, partly because many Christians are themselves involved in corrupt practices, as Ken has already set out. He also notes the rise of Pentecostalism and how that has shifted church priorities towards more conservative social issues. And I'll come back to that again in a few minutes, just to think a bit more about that. And also maybe regarding how people think about democratic accountability. But despite these challenges, Ken has made a very clear and compelling argument that churches continue to enjoy public confidence and to speak out, particularly in moments of national political turbulence. And that's a remarkable legacy of the churches and a constant banner for them to carry. I would highly commend what Ken has written and would call on anyone who's interested in the history of the state of Malawi and in particularly the contribution of churches to read this. But in my final comments, I just want to probe a little bit deeper and maybe begin the stream of questions that will no doubt be percolating among today's audience. First, I wonder to what extent the distinct tradition of the CCAP synods, and Ken mentioned this today, but the extent to which those distinct traditions were amplified by suspicions of collusion with the one-party regime along geographical and ethnic lines, and to what extent that weakened the CCAP from making any kind of resolute response to either Banda or the end of the regime. In contrast to, as he's spoken to us about today, the really meaningful intervention of the pastoral letters produced by the Catholic bishops in 1961 and 1992. Was it in part because the Catholic Church was seen as less complicit with the MCP, that they had a more influential voice? Was it because Catholicism has a fixed hierarchy that might be seen as distinctive from the membership of the church itself, whereas the governance of the Presbyterian churches were also involved in political activities? Was it because Catholicism had not had the historic divisions that have remained prevalent in the CCAP down to the present? On the other hand, might it be argued that Presbyterians were more comfortable with pushing an authoritarian mode of uniformity? Is it in the DNA of Presbyterians to seek that kind of hegemony? Or perhaps that they are more susceptible to accepting the kind of messianic mantle that the MCP based on Banda? Ross alludes to some of these issues, but the degree to which there are systemic trends or predispositions in the ecclesiastical, let's call it DNA, of the churches that we've been talking about today may give some insights into the future ability of those very same churches to contribute to the Malawian nation going forward. Or put differently, such critical reflexivity may serve to better prepare those churches to speak prophetically in the future. This is all the more pressing when drawing on demographic evidence. Ken draws the conclusion, as he's already mentioned, this is a quote from his article, with close to 80% of Malawians professing to be Christian, it is an inevitable conclusion that it is not someone else who is perpetrating the corruption. It is the Christians themselves, at least in large measure. This poses searching questions to the churches and limits their credibility as anti-corruption advocates in the public square. The more so when not only individual Christians, but the churches as institutions are sucked into the politics of patrimonialism and clientage. That's an end of a quote. So I'm kind of hammering home a point that Ken has already made very effectively. And again, this is not a situation distinctive to Malawi, but this kind of critical historical analysis that's been offered by this chapter and also in the excellent centenary volume on the CCAP offers an opportunity for churches to think reflectively about their past in order to better prepare themselves for their future. The study also raises questions about the implications over the alignment of churches to political power. This is, of course, not a situation, again, unique to Malawi. Churches have not always been at their best or articulated their values most clearly when they are aligned to political power or to particular political narratives. And current events in the United States and Russia show us that churches often get it quite wrong when they try to justify political norms. And it's not limited to Christianity. We can see this in the Asian subcontinent and in the Middle East at the moment as well. But Ken also demonstrates that shifts in Christianity in Malawi, which he calls Pentecostalization, as other scholars have as well, may be responsible for cultural shifts that reprioritize moral issues, which in the past will have been seen as economic, environmental, social justice, the foundations of democracy, to a different set of priorities, which, again, using the terms that he just used, fit into a wider global phenomena that is culture wars, in which conservative Christian narratives are politicized. And I think he actually summarizes this quite nicely in a quote from James Tenga. Quote, rather than building institutions that foster pluralism, support human rights, and limit government power, Christian action is defined as supporting a particular set of morals seen to be God-pleasing and the putting into place of a regime committed to enforcing them. Again, end of quote. Again, I want to stress this is not something unique to Malawi, but it might be noted that some of those tensions already existed in Malawian Presbyterianism in the distinct identities of the synods of the CCAP. The question is, overarching, how effectively can Christianity speak to the exigencies of the moment when churches struggle to agree on what those exigencies are? It might be clearer when a dictatorship falls or a constitution is under threat, but the lack of a unified set of ideals underpinned by a shared faith make it difficult for churches to speak effectively and in a sustained manner into political spheres. Another aspect that might have been helpfully explored, and this is just in passing, is to think a bit about the role that churches have played in local and tertiary education, as well as in healthcare, because the churches are such key players in those spaces, and those spaces are very much important for the shaping of democratic identities. How did these activities feed into the relationship between the churches and the state? How did that change through this political period? And how might churches in their educational activities prepare not just good Presbyterians or good Catholics or good Anglicans, but good citizens for a democratic Malawi? Now, the cheeky, impish side of my personality would suggest perhaps one might read Ross's excellent and clear chapter and conclude that Christians are best placed to speak prophetically from the margins. But again, that might be my inner Anabaptist speaking, or a deep-seated affection for the Society of Friends. While it is not the purpose or intent of Ross's chapter, it would be good in this final comment from me and in the friendly confines of this environment to maybe ask Professor Ross to think a little bit more about what he thinks a healthy relationship between church and state might look like in the future of Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Scott. Ken, I don't know if that's an intro to an answer that you'd like to begin, or whether that's a longer term project that Scott's proposing there.
Well, it's a great question. It's a big question, and I think it really puts the question of what we learn from all of this history of 60 years. I think if I circle it around with where Scott started, I think one very significant thing is probably the time when the churches really were responsible for shaping Malawi's history in the democratic era was their successful resistance of the third term bid. And a feature of that is that the churches were very united. The state threw everything at getting that bid to succeed. But I think the reason that the power of the state was thwarted was because the churches stood together. But unfortunately, as Scott has unerringly detected, this rather stands in contrast with most of the time when they are somehow fragmented. And politicians are not stupid, so they will prefer to have a fragmented church scene where they can play off different factions against each other, and so that has been a weakness. I mean, even in the political transition, which I was calling the finest hour, the CCAP did not manage to be united through it. It fragmented on regional lines. And that has recurrently happened. It's still been happening even in very recent years. So I think that would be one big takeaway, that if the churches, either as discrete churches or as an entire Christian community, if they want to be effective in the political space and able to address the government effectively in critical times, fostering their own unity is a very big item on the agenda.
David Bowen, might we turn to you for your question, please?
Hi, Ken. Many thanks for the usual clarity, and thank you to Scott as well. Yeah, my question is, would it be possible for you to say, it's no surprise to you, but would it be possible if you could say anything about the relationship between the state and Muslim communities? You know, 15% of Malawi. As you know, they were early supporters of the pastoral letter. They've provided a national president. They've been active in the Public Affairs Committee and have on occasion made radical critique of the government. Now, I know you were talking about Christianity, but it might, I thought, have been worth a footnote, or at least a mention of the fact that there are other religious players in the game. The Muslims, of course, being the main ones. So that's my question. Thank you.
No, thanks, David. Absolutely, the Muslim community is the main player besides the churches, and I think it probably has to be said that the churches were quite slow to engage the Muslim community as a collaborator in the political realm after independence. In fact, it was actually more the state that was active in taking an inclusive approach to Muslim communities when the churches had not really woken up to the issue. And it was probably more in the 1980s that there was a bit of a shift as churches became more aware that there might be points at which they need to make common cause with the Muslim community. But the formation of the Public Affairs Committee in the middle of 1992 probably was the game changer here. And I think it's important to recognize these were very, very tense political times. And as a minority community, Muslims always have to be a bit cautious about how they're going to be positioned. But they did step up and became full members of the Public Affairs Committee. And it was really a new thing to have. By the time you've got the Christian community and the Muslim community working together, it's maybe not all, but it's getting quite close to all Malawians. So the state then really had to sit up and take this organization seriously. And I think also important that this was not just a momentary thing, but the Public Affairs Committee has continued. It's now more than 30 years of this Christian-Muslim collaboration in the public space. And in fact, it's been active even very recently in addressing political situation. So I think this is an area that it has come quite far if we compare where it started in the 60s and what's happening now. This would be another paper, and maybe you'll write it, David.
Yeah, it would have to be somebody more knowledgeable than I. Thank you very much for your answer.
Patrick Grady, would you like to come in?
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Zikomo. What a fantastic presentation, Ken. And great to see you. And likewise, Scott, for your summary. As I think I said in the chat there, I mean, I think you sort of touched on this a bit, but I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the precise triggers for the pastoral letter in 1992 and why it was then and not any earlier or any later even. And is your research showing any sort of particular individuals within the Bishops' Conference or elsewhere that were significant in the drafting of it and pushing it forward and really catalysing it and then out into the wider parishes as you described.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Patrick. It's good to have a seasoned politician in this discussion. Yeah, there's been quite a bit of analysis about how the pastoral letter came to happen. It was very unexpected at the time, and even reflecting afterwards, it takes a bit of explaining. I know some analysis has put emphasis on the visit of the Pope to Malawi in 1989. And at the time, there was starting to be rumblings about, discontent with Malawi's authoritarianism and repression. But the Pope did not say anything publicly that could be interpreted as critical of Malawi's political dispensation. But it's believed that when he had a private meeting with the bishops, he did counsel them about this. And this was a lot about applying the social teaching of the Catholic Church, the post-Vatican II social teaching to the Malawi situation. And it does seem to me quite plausible that the bishops were reflecting on this between 1989 and 1992, and that both informed what they said and gave them the courage to say it. So that would be one factor. The other thing is that you'll remember it was a time of massive changes in the international order. So the Cold War ended, apartheid crumbled in South Africa. These were shockwaves everywhere, but they also changed the situation in Malawi. And there were underground political movements were already forming. They had to be very cautious. It probably would have been difficult for them to take the initiative. So that there's quite a lot that was brewing in that period. But I still think we have to take our hats off to the Catholic bishops. So they did literally put their lives on the line to make this statement, and we have to salute that courage. But let me pause there and mention to Stuart that we've got a live question in the chapel. If we could bring that in, and then perhaps go back online.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ross, for the presentation and for reminding us of the history of Malawi and of the role that the church has played in the social transformation of the country. My question touches on you've given us an analysis of what the church leaders did in the past from the time when Malawi got independence up to 1992 and going forward. I just want to know from you, based on your analysis, is the church, the present church today, prophetic?
Well, it's a little bit tempting for me here to plead being a historian and say I don't want to say anything about the present, but you've tempted me to come out of history. I think the short answer would be no. If we compare with the high prophetic moments in the past, like when Jonathan Sangaya was going to meet President Banda by himself and trying to give him counsel and ending up getting beaten up as a result, or when Saindi Chipangwe was stepping up, preaching on a national occasion, or even James Tenga Tenga. Many years later, Peter Calesso in St. Columba's in Blantyre, people who really felt compelled by their calling to speak to public affairs and even speak to the state in a way that was not going to be welcome. It's difficult to see that in the current environment. Maybe the closest to it is, the Catholic bishops are still producing their pastoral letters. And I think they might be the closest that we have to a really prophetic voice. But I think you have to do something about the Presbyterians.
Thank you, Ken. We've a flurry of questions. Felix, you've patiently had your hand up for some time. Apologies. We'll come to you in just a second. Then Dr. Banda has a question about President Banda, and then Dr. John Luanda, preceded by Eunice and Bea. Felix, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for a great presentation, Prof, as usual. Yeah, I remember in your writings you described the way the church has acted politically to be a catalyst for change, especially the 1992 saga. I wonder though, and I'm kind of like piggybacking on the question that was asked before. I wonder though, how much of the geopolitical scene of the day comes into play. I mean, the Cold War has ended. It's after 1989, the breaking down of the Berlin Wall. And then as well, you have all these sanctions against the Banda regime. And it almost feels like, the church is opportunistic. It finds a place where it can actually say something, and so comes in and does something. And I don't know whether it's us from the theological perspective that basically kind of like put the church up there as, look, we are the ones that brought this thing in. We brought the democracy into play, because of of the pastoral letters and all. And so, yeah, I wondered what extent you think that the church there was just riding on a wave of something that's there, which would mean at worst it was opportunistic. Right, and that there were all these other forces that were at play, and why didn't the church speak out earlier, and why did the global church, and I think I do remember the World Reformed Movement also came and had an audience with Kamuzu. And knowing that Kamuzu's shenanigans had been going on for a long time, why wasn't it that they had come in earlier? So, yeah, just that thought. I don't know how you'd respond. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a soul-searching question for Malawi and Malawians, and it certainly at the time in 1992, it didn't feel opportunistic. It really felt the opposite, that it was very courageous of the Catholic bishops to publish their letter. But there is still force in what you're saying when you look at the sweep of history. It was a moment of opportunity, that there was already a lot of stirrings of change under the surface, and so perhaps they were responding to that. So I think it's still good for the churches to search their souls about what happened in the preceding 30 years. I did mention the Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, that is not a proud part of Malawi's history. Their sufferings were really terrible. And it was simply for professing a particular religious viewpoint. And the churches, they were kind of uneasy, but they basically stood back and allowed terrible persecution to be inflicted by the state on one victimized religious community. On the other hand, we've mentioned some of the steps that the church tried to take, kind of going against the tide in difficult time. For example, when Orton and Vera Chirwa were abducted from Zambia in 1981, the church really went out on a limb to try to protect their lives. So it looked at one point as if they'd be sentenced to death. And the church did come in and possibly made the difference. It didn't save the Chirwas from having long years in prison, but it might have saved their lives. So I've looked at the whole 64 to 92 period, and generally it's quite true that the church was compromised, but there were these exceptional moments and exceptional individuals who I think did create a little bit of distance. But again, if we're talking about looking to the future, I think there's salutary lessons to be learned. So I think I would be inclined to accept your critique, Felix.
The questioners identified just as Banda on this call. Is that Dr. Paul Banda from Tarleton University? Would you like to come in?
Yes. Thanks, Professor Ross, for your presentation. My question was on just for you to give us this international perspective in terms of you've talked about the reaction of the CCAP, but that's the church in Malawi. But I wanted you to say something in terms of what was going on in the UK. Were there any discussions in terms of what was happening in Malawi? Because we know that almost every year, Dr. Banda used to go to the UK. Most of them were private visits. Was there any time when they would call him and try to sit down with him to say, look, what you are doing in Malawi is not good in terms of how the church looks, especially that you are identifying yourself as a Christian and as an elder in the church? Remember that even for the Roman Catholic bishops, for them to write their pastoral letter in 1992, there was also this international push. Remember, Pope John Paul had come to Malawi, talked to the bishops. So I wanted to, even for the CCAP, for you to give us this international perspective, something that we see with the Roman Catholic Church. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Well, your question speaks right into the Scotland-Malawi space, because you're quite right that Dr. Banda did make visits regularly to Scotland. He had lived in Scotland in the 1930s, and he was well connected there. And you might remember a significant part of his ideology was his claim to be a Church of Scotland elder, which was something that he repeated often. And it was true. I mean, he was a practicing Presbyterian when he was in Scotland, and he was ordained as an elder, and for some time was a practicing elder. And so he would reconnect with the church when he went on visits to Scotland. And there was one particular church in Edinburgh where he would go for worship, and this was often given a high profile in the Malawi media, and it was somehow part of the ideological substructure that propped up the regime. And one of these visits took place, I think, in 1990. So it was when there was just starting to be the stirrings of change. And so it was quite highly charged. Better not go on too long about this, but one thing that in terms of international dimension that was very powerful in the aftermath of the pastoral letter is that the officials of the Church of Scotland came on the BBC World Service and undermined Banda's status as church elder. So they said that he's no longer a practicing elder, which actually was true, because he didn't really have a church role after he came back to Malawi. But this kind of punctured his rhetoric about being the church elder, and it was part of kind of dispelling the mystique that Banda had gathered around himself. So maybe just I can leave it there as one example of the international dimension playing into Malawi's politics and the Banda regime in particular.
Eunice Mbia, please.
Thank you so much, Prof. I guess part of the question may have been answered when you talked about Banda and his relationship with the Presbyterian Church. But can you shed more light, especially looking at the continuities that now we have? We have had like Muntalika as a Catholic, Chakwera, a pastor of the Assemblies Church of God, that being Pentecostal. And so I just wanted to know, does this have any, like in general, there are any conflicts that we can see or any impact that we can see in terms of influencing the church and how it sheds light on the crisis that Malawians have faced?
Yeah, it's a good question, Eunice. I mean, it's certainly true that so far all of Malawi's presidents have had a clear religious identity. Probably applies to most Malawi politicians. In fact. I'm not sure if the Democratic presidents have been so brazen as Banda was in using a religious status or a religious identity as part of the ideology that propped him up in power. But it would be a good study to do, and of course it's quite current having a president who is actually a pastor, who spent the vast majority of his career as a church pastor, and only quite late in life became a politician. So I think that's something that will call for analysis. For historians, maybe we'll need a little bit of distance from it before we can do that. And I must admit, I haven't in this chapter really focused in on the individual political leaders and how that interplayed with religious themes or religious identity. But maybe that's your next project, Eunice, and I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Ken. Sorry, Eunice. Yeah. And with time in mind, final question, Dr. John Luanda.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. My question, Prof, tends to be general as usual. When I'm talking about subjects I don't know much about, I like sort of show off. Professor Ross was my internal examiner for my PhD. Dr. A.C. Ross was a friend, particularly after the multi-party, and we used to go and sit, and I sat with him when he was in hospital, dying. Jack Thompson was my PhD supervisor. I'll stop there, I'm just showing off a bit. Anyway, I am informed by popular culture. And a few years ago, once Chakwera started going downhill, popular culture had it that Dr. Banda was done for by his fellow doctors. Doctors in this case, meaning medical doctors like myself, PhD doctors, again, like myself. Muluzo was done for by fellow businessmen. Bingu was done for by fellow economists. Remember DPP, Diesel Petrol Palibe. Joyce Banda was done for by fellow women who did not vote for her in sufficient numbers. And more convincingly, APM was certainly done for by fellow lawyers. Now, this was said when Chakwera started disappointing people, and they said, oh, don't worry, he will be done for by fellow reverends. Now, this has some relevance to Eunice's question. In brackets, my view is that there's ecumenical or evangelical movements in most churches. You go to CCAP, Anglican, nowadays they're all the same, praise team and all that stuff. And this evangelism is tending towards back to the thing, oh, we're just here temporarily, we're going to have our rewards in heaven, close brackets. Now, I was in Nkopola and shared, not a room, but accommodation with the bigwigs of the MCP when the president was in Chikoko Bay. And my taxi driver was informing me who was going to collect their 50,000 kwachas. And a lot of the reverends went there, Anglican, CCAP. I didn't hear about Catholics. So the question is, what is it that is making the church leaders less potent now? Is it the money? As I said in my 2006 paper, The Violence of Money in Malawi Politics, or is it a fall in moral standards? End of long question.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Luanda. I think you're taking your revenge on your internal examiner, but this is a brilliant analysis, a very interesting one. But in some ways, I mean, as usual, it's so well informed. But it's a little bit contradictory in that it's on this frame of analysis, Chakwera is supposed to be undone by fellow pastors, and yet it's sounding like he has the ways and means to keep the pastors in line. But I think in this period, what I've called the period of entanglement of church and state, I think what you're talking about at Cupola Lodge, it's a major mechanism in the entanglement, and as you know, we're almost all of us, whatever sector we're in, we're very resource strapped in Malawi. Government is still a source of resources, and so it's very easy for churches to get drawn in to the patrimonialism. And so I think it also comes back to Dr. Chitsulo's question. It probably needs some rediscovery of vocation. You know, who's going to be the Peter Kaleso of today. I think that's perhaps quite a challenging point to end on.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm sure there could be rich discussion, but we'll need to save that for offline or another time, just with time in mind. So thank you very much indeed to Reverend Professor Kenneth R. Ross, to Professor Scott Spurlock, and to everybody for making time to join, and for everybody's interest, particularly to those of you taking part live in person in Zomba. Recording of the event, the presentations, the chat log from today will go up online on the Scotland-Malawi Partnership website after the event. You're very welcome to the next webinar in the series. It's on the judiciary's role in the construction of childhood images. It will be held on October the 2nd at 2 p.m. UK time, when we'll hear from Dr. Garton Kamchedzera and Dr. Jude Turbine. Until then, thank you all very much. Take care and goodbye for now.